This is the central London control centre of Inmarsat, who've been the British company really at the forefront of helping to solve this riddle. And what they've actually done is they've looked back at other 777 Malaysian flights, and they've looked at what signals those have sent to their Indian Ocean satellite.
On March 8, 2014, flight MH370 erased itself from the modern world. There was no distress call and no warning of any kind. Hours after it vanished, the aircraft left behind a digital phantom, a faint sequence of signals recorded by a satellite tens of thousands of miles away. From these invisible echoes, investigators drew a map, a route pointing toward what was believed to be the aircraft's final resting place.
They've managed to work out that the flight definitely took off and went south, ending up somewhere down here in the southern Indian Ocean, rather than in that northern corridor where they've also been looking.
It triggered the largest and most expensive search operation in history. What were these ghostly signals? And could they truly reveal the real location of MH370? Let's descend into a mystery that has endured for more than a decade. Maps from the void. In the chaotic weeks following the disappearance of MH370, the global aviation community faced an intolerable reality. One of the most advanced aircraft in the world had vanished without leaving behind a single electronic trace. Amid this information vacuum, an announcement emerged from the British satellite communications company Inmarsat. As their engineers reviewed system logs, they discovered something no one had expected, long after all other forms of communication had fallen silent. The satellite data unit on board MH370 continued to respond automatically to routine test signals from one of their geostationary satellites. These signals, known as handshakes, carried no information about position, speed, or altitude. They were simply technical confirmations that the aircraft terminal was still powered and operational. Yet hidden within these simple signals was a layer of critically important information. By precisely measuring the time it took for a signal to travel from the satellite to the aircraft and back again, analysts could calculate the distance between them. This measurement, known as burst timing offset, did not yield a specific point. Instead, it generated a vast circle on the surface of the Earth, representing every possible location of the aircraft at the moment the signal was sent. When this information was combined with changes in signal frequency caused by the movement of the aircraft, an effect similar to the shift in sound from a passing ambulance siren, investigators were able to narrow the possibilities down to two narrow flight corridors, often described as arcs. One arc stretched northward across the Asian continent. The other extended southward, deep into the Indian Ocean. Based on analyses of remaining fuel and plausible flight paths, international investigation teams led by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau reached a conclusion that was both reasonable and scientifically grounded. The aircraft had flown south. The map was formed. A vast yet finite search area was defined. The world watched as advanced technologies were deployed, confident that within these carefully drawn lines, the answer to the fate of MH370 awaited discovery. Dislocated echoes. While the large-scale search unfolded in the southern Indian Ocean, aviation safety investigators took a closer look at the final minutes during which MH370 still existed within the normal world. What they found did not align with the image of a sudden and catastrophic technical failure. The disappearance was not a single event. It was a sequence of actions carried out in a precise order. First, the transponder, the device that identifies an aircraft to civilian air traffic controllers, stopped transmitting. About 1 minute later, the ACARS system, responsible for reporting aircraft status, also went silent between these two events. The cockpit made one final radio transmission. The pilot's voice was calm, showing no sign of stress or danger. It was simply a procedural farewell. Good night. Malaysia, 370. The timing of this silence was striking. It occurred exactly at the boundary between two air traffic control regions, Malaysia, and Vietnam. This was the moment most prone to confusion over monitoring responsibility, a procedural gap that could delay the raising of an alarm by precious minutes. But the most troubling detail came from another source entirely: military radar. Unlike civilian systems, primary military radar does not require an aircraft transponder to function. Data later released by the Royal Malaysian Air Force showed that MH370 did not continue straight ahead after disappearing from civilian radar. Instead, it executed a sharp and deliberate turn, flying back toward the southwest, crossing the Malay Peninsula and heading out over the Strait of Malacca. This was the behavior of an aircraft under active control, not a vehicle spiraling into chaos. These intentional actions, combined with the silence rising from the depths of the ocean where the search was taking place, began to form a profound cognitive dissonance. The satellite map pointed in one direction, yet the aircraft's final known actions told a completely different story. For years, the ocean offered no answers. Gradually, the deep silence of the seabed ceased to signify an absence of evidence and instead became a form of evidence in itself. Re-examining the Inmarsat data. Years after the sounds of seabed search equipment faded into silence, a new investigation began. This inquiry did not take place across vast oceans, but within the abstract and quiet realm of numbers. A group of independent experts, including veteran aerospace engineers, commercial pilots, and data scientists, chose to set aside all hypotheses and return to the single true starting point of the mystery: the raw satellite data from Inmarsat. Their goal was not to uncover something new, but to perform a task that was almost forensic in nature. They sought to independently verify every step in the chain of reasoning that had guided the most expensive search in history toward the southern Indian Ocean. Their work was methodical, even monotonous. They were not searching for drama. They were searching for consistency. They rebuilt complex mathematical models from scratch, cross-checked physical constants related to the speed of light and Doppler effects, and reran countless flight path simulations on supercomputers in the first months. Their results appeared to reinforce the official conclusion: the burst timing offset values, distance measures based on signal travel time, when recalculated independently, still traced the familiar arcs across the global map. Mathematically, this was undeniable. At those moments, MH370 had to be somewhere along those immense curves. However, when the investigation turned to the second and more delicate layer of data, the burst frequency offset values, small anomalies began to emerge. BFO data, which records changes in signal frequency, is like trying to determine the precise pitch of a siren heard from a moving vehicle at a distance. It is influenced by countless factors: aircraft motion, electronic component temperature, minor fluctuations in power supply. All can introduce noise into the data. In the original investigation, this noise was treated as statistical error and smoothed by algorithms to reveal an overall trend. The independent group refused to dismiss it. They focused on a specific event noted in technical logs, but largely considered insignificant. Shortly after MH370 disappeared from civilian radar, its satellite data unit underwent a complete reboot. The official report assumed this was an automatic consequence, possibly caused by a temporary power interruption when someone in the cockpit began shutting down other systems in sequence. This assumption seemed reasonable and fit the narrative of deliberate actions in the cockpit. But as analysts reviewed thousands of pages of Boeing technical documentation and SDU maintenance manuals, they realized the reboot process was not so simple. Certain system parameters, usually accessed only during ground maintenance, could influence how the SDU communicated with the satellite after it came back online. The entire chain of complex calculations that led to the conclusion of a southern flight path, and the entire search costing hundreds of millions of dollars. rested on a single foundational assumption. It was an assumption that had never been proven: that after rebooting, the SDU operated in its manufacturer default state. That assumption had been accepted simply because it was the most reasonable path available. The assumption, the investigation ignored. The investigation now stood at the edge of a cognitive abyss. What if that core assumption, the logical anchor that had kept the entire official search from drifting, was wrong? What if the SDU reboot was not a random event at all, but a deliberate action carried out to alter the way the system reported its own status? This was no longer an unfounded speculation. Changing such parameters lay beyond the reach of a pilot using standard cockpit controls. Yet it was entirely possible for someone with deep maintenance knowledge and physical access to the aircraft's electronics bay. This cramped technical compartment houses the electronic brain of the 777 and sits directly beneath the floor of the first-class cabin. The investigative team made a pivotal decision. They would rerun the entire Inmarsat data analysis model once more, but this time they would alter a single variable. They would introduce a hypothesis in which the SDU had rebooted with a different reference frequency, an action reflecting intentional human intervention. When the simulation was rerun with this new variable, what appeared on the screens was neither a chaotic scatter of data points nor an error message. The result was startling clarity. The BFO values, which had previously appeared noisy and unstable, reorganized themselves into a smooth and consistent curve. Yet this curve no longer matched an aircraft flying south. Instead, the entire sequence of 7 handshake signals, spanning 7 hours of silent flight, aligned perfectly with its symmetrical arc on the Earth's map, the Northern Corridor. This discovery sent a seismic shock through the foundations of the years-long investigation. It did not merely suggest that the search had taken place in the wrong location. It demonstrated something far more disturbing. The single dataset trusted by the world was, in fact, a text that could be read in 2 completely opposite ways, depending on a single assumption introduced by the reader. The Inmarsat data was not a map pointing to a destination. It was a perfect mirror image, a symmetrical puzzle. The international community, following logic that was entirely reasonable and unquestioned at the time, had chosen the reflection that led into an empty ocean. The northern route, dismissed early because it crossed too much defended airspace, suddenly re-emerged as a possibility validated by the very evidence once used to reject it. This route did not lead into open water. It led into a geopolitical labyrinth, crossing the aviation deserts of the Himalayan range and pointing toward the vast and remote lands of Central Asia. The silence of the southern Indian Ocean now carried a new explanation. The aircraft had never been there. The northern route, at this point. The entire known sequence of MH370 events was re-examined from the beginning under the light of this shocking discovery. Every action and every detail once interpreted as part of a tragedy or an act of desperation now took on a completely different meaning. It became cold, methodical, and alarmingly intelligent. The shutdown of the transponder and communication systems in precise sequence at an airspace boundary was no longer simple concealment. It was the opening move in a meticulously staged plan to seize absolute electronic control and create a cognitive blind spot for air traffic controllers. The sharp and controlled turn was no longer an abnormal deviation during an emergency. It was the calculated starting point of a pre-planned flight path, designed to avoid commercial air routes and exploit weaknesses in air defense radar networks. Yet the most unsettling reinterpretation, the core of the entire event, lay within the Inmarsat system itself. The SDU reboot could no longer be viewed as an accidental glitch or an error by the perpetrator. It became the central move, an act of brilliance within a global scale of deception. Whoever orchestrated this disappearance did not fail to silence the aircraft completely. On the contrary, they deliberately allowed one system to survive. a system they knew investigators would cling to as their sole remaining hope. They chose to leave a trace. But it was not a trace leading to the truth. It was a trace engineered to be systematically misunderstood. The handshake signals were not accidental clues left behind. They were a carefully constructed diversion, a poisoned digital breadcrumb trail. By manipulating a deep technical parameter within the system, a detail they knew early investigators would overlook or dismiss as insignificant, the architect of the plan created a perfect digital phantom. They produced a dataset that appeared mathematically sound, robust enough to convince the world to invest hundreds of millions of dollars and years of searching, yet one that pointed in the exact opposite direction of reality. The true danger was no longer an aircraft that had crashed in an unknown location. The danger was the realization that an individual or group not only understood the operation of a Boeing 777 at an expert level, but also possessed a deep understanding of how the global aviation surveillance system works. They understood investigator psychology, the assumptions that would be made, and how to exploit those assumptions to lead the entire world into a futile search. MH370 was no longer a missing aircraft. It had been transformed into an information weapon, a tool designed to prove that the most perfect deception is one disguised as undeniable scientific truth. The radar void and the silence of nations, with the Northern Corridor confirmed as a mathematically valid possibility. The independent investigation entered a new and far more difficult phase. The challenge was no longer the interpretation of satellite data, but the search for physical confirmation in the real world. Unlike the southern Indian Ocean, the northern route was not an empty wilderness. It passed through or near the airspace of multiple nations: Thailand, Myanmar, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and several Central Asian states. Most of these regions are monitored by powerful military radar systems. Unlike civilian radar, primary military radar does not rely on an aircraft transponder. It sends out radio waves and listens for echoes returning from any object in the sky. A Boeing 777, even if invisible to civilian air traffic control, should in theory still appear as a bright return on military radar screens. Investigators submitted formal requests, presenting their new analyses and asking the relevant governments to review radar logs from the night of March 8, 2014. The response they received was an almost uniform wall of silence. Some countries replied that no unidentified targets had been detected. Others stated that radar systems in the region were not operating at full capacity at the time because no threat had been recorded. Early reports from unofficial sources about unusual radar tracks were quickly withdrawn or explained away as atmospheric interference. The investigation was no longer a struggle against a lack of data. As it had been in the early days, it had become a confrontation with deliberate information control. The truth no longer seemed lost on the ocean floor. It appeared to be locked away inside national security archives. The fear driving the investigation changed in nature. It no longer came from an invisible mastermind, but from the very visible systems designed to protect us. The logic behind this silence, however troubling, was entirely understandable. For any government to admit that a large commercial aircraft had crossed its sovereign airspace without being detected, identified, or intercepted would be an admission of a catastrophic national security failure. It would raise deeply uncomfortable questions about air defense capability and weakened deterrence. Faced with two choices: acknowledging an embarrassing intelligence failure or remaining silent and allowing a mystery to persist, silence became a strategic decision. Why the search went in the wrong direction? The investigation reached its final limit. There was no new data left to analyze and no doors left to knock on. All that remained were the pieces already laid out on the table. A precisely calculated disappearance, a deliberate turn back, an anomalous satellite system reboot, a dataset that could be read in two opposing ways, a failed physical search in the south, and a wall of silence in the north. At this point, The film no longer tries to answer the question, where is MH370? Instead, it returns to the question that haunted the investigation from the beginning. Why did the only reliable data trail contradict the outcome of the physical search so completely? The answer, formed from the full chain of evidence presented, is not a location on a map. It is cognitive in nature. The contradiction was not a failure of the investigation. The contradiction was the purpose of the plan. The Inmarsat data was never a map left behind by mistake. It was a perfectly designed trap. The architect of the Disappearance did not attempt to erase MH370 from every system. They did something far more subtle. They transformed the aircraft into a tool for creating an unsolvable mystery. They exploited deep knowledge not only of aviation engineering, but of human psychology and investigative processes. They understood that in an information vacuum, people will cling to any data that appears scientific. They knew investigators would follow the path that was least complex geopolitically. And they constructed a phantom dataset, a sequence of signals that looked flawless, to guide the entire world down that path. The search in the southern Indian Ocean was not a mistake. It was the anticipated outcome of a carefully executed diversion. The disappearance of MH370 is not a story of failure. Failure of technology, of pilots, or of aircraft. It is the story of a successful operation, successful in erasing an aircraft from the physical world and replacing it with a riddle without an answer. A riddle that forced global resources to focus on an empty ocean, while the truth, whatever it may be, remained hidden behind the very noise of the search itself. The final answer offers no comfort. It is the acknowledgement of a frightening possibility. Our most advanced technologies can not only fail, they can be turned into instruments of perfect deception. A deception that works best when it is disguised as undeniable scientific truth.